Hello friends of analog photography and welcome to the latest video. This video is about how to shoot a 35mm film. But, and here's the big but, I don't want this to be one of those videos where I just show you how to load the film into your camera and then I'm jumping around making fancy pictures and blending them into the video and yeah, being fancy and cool. I like such videos, but I actually want to try to give you more knowledge about film, how film works, the different types of film, and of course at the end I will show you how to load your film into the camera and so on and so forth. But basically I want this video to really give you a value, okay? To bring you more knowledge than just knowing how to load your film into a camera, because there are enough videos out there that show you how to load a film into your camera. So this has a pro, because you will learn way more. And of course this has its cons, because this video will be very theoretical and it will be, well, very dry. It's a very theoretical, very technical video. But I absolutely encourage you to stick until the end, because you will learn super important things about film. And these things apply to every film photographer, no matter if you're shooting with an SLR, a large format camera, or with a point-and-shoot camera. If you're planning to shoot with a point-and-shoot camera, I also encourage you to watch until the end, because loading film into your point-and-shoot camera most of the time works the same way as loading film into an SLR camera. If you're planning on shooting large format, I recommend you to stick around when I talk about all the film theory stuff, but then obviously the camera choice or talking about an SLR camera and so on is not that interesting for you anymore. But you're welcome to stick until the end anyway. Okay, now to make this video more easy for you and more, well, user-friendly, it is divided in different chapters. You find the time codes down in the description, so if you already know some stuff and you want to skip the chapter, you can skip it, or if you are here just to see how to load film into a camera, well, then you can skip all the way through loading film into your camera. Okay, I'd say we start right in. And well, yeah, as usual, if you like my stuff, please subscribe to my channel, hit the bell button so you're not missing out the next part of this video, because it will be super interesting. I'm gonna show you how to develop your film at home, and again with a little bit more theory behind the things and not just, well, mixing chemicals and going on. Yeah, I'd say let's roll the intro and start right in. I should stop talking and start the video. Here we go. Okay, welcome back. Now for the beginning, I'm gonna tell you the chapters that this video is divided into, and then we're gonna start, okay? Now let's start with the chapters. In chapter 1, we're gonna talk about the different film types. This will be a relatively short chapter. And chapter 2, we're gonna talk about the different sensitivity types of film. This is super interesting, and I'm not referring to ISO in chapter 2. ISO is a chapter for itself. In chapter 3, I'm very shortly talk about the different types of emulsion. And in chapter 4, we are talking about what ISO is and what it means. And chapter 5 is, well, we're talking about cameras or how to choose the right camera. And in chapter 6, I finally show you how to put film into your camera. So let's start. Okay, let's start by talking about the different types of film. The most common film types are, well, color and black and white films. But there are a few more types of film. There is standard black and white film, and there is standard color film. These are, well, standard is the wrong way, it's print film. So it means these films will give you negative images that are originally meant to be printed in the darkroom. Then you have another kind of black and white film, which is so-called technical black and white film. This black and white film is special because it is a super high resolution film. In this case, it's an ADOX film from, it's called CMS22 Pro, and as far as I know, right at the moment, this is the highest resolution film you can get. And then there's a third type of film, and you can get this film in either color or black and white. It is the so-called reversal film. Quite sure you all know what reversal film is. I can't show you reversal film right here because I'm not shooting reversal film at all. I'm more towards the, well, print film things because I'm printing in the darkroom. Okay, so these are the different types of film. Okay, now let's talk about the different sensitivity types of film. Whew. Sounds complicated, but it really is not. And I'm quite sure you've already heard some of the words you're about to hear. When I say sensitivity, I'm not talking about ISO. ISO, yes, it's also sensitivity, but this is, well, this is more the way of sensitivity when it comes to how much light you need to actually bring a picture onto the film. The way of sensitivity that I'm talking about is more like the color spectrum of light. So what I want you to understand is that there are different types of film that are sensitive to different parts of the light spectrum. Okay? I'd say we start right in. It's the easiest way. Let's start with the so-called orthochromatic film. Orthochromatic film is the oldest type of film, and this film is mostly sensitive towards the left side of the spectrum. It means it's sensitive from blue light over to green, yellow and slightly orangish light. This old type of emulsion is not sensitive to red light at all, and this is why old pictures look like they look. A cool thing about orthochromatic film though is you can actually, well, develop it in the darkroom and watch it how it's being developed. It's super interesting because it's not sensitive to red light. You could develop it under red light. Okay, the next kind of film I want to talk to you about is panchromatic film. Panchromatic film is nowadays most common film. Nearly all films you are buying are panchromatic. Panchromatic means they are reacting to all colors of the light. They are reacting from blue light all the way up to red light. And this is also why you have to work with these films in total darkness. You cannot develop them under red light or something like this. You have to work with these films in total darkness. The next type of film is the so-called orthopanchromatic film. Oh, sounds complicated, huh? But it isn't. It really isn't. Orthopanchromatic film is a panchromatic film with reduced red sensitivity. As easy as that. Means it is sensitive to the whole light spectrum, but a little bit less sensitive to the red part of the spectrum. Easy. Okay, let's talk about the next film type, which is super panchromatic film. What's that again? It's also super easy. Super panchromatic film is sensitive to the whole spectrum of visible light, but also to some parts of the infrared spectrum. So it's not a pure infrared film, but it is sensitive towards the infrared part of the spectrum. So you can do some slight infrared photography experiments with this film, and it can bring you super interesting results. So that's super panchromatic film. And then there's another kind of film, which is the so-called infrared film. And as the name suggests, this film is super sensitive towards the infrared spectrum of light and is most of the time used for, well, obviously infrared photography. For infrared photography you need a special filter, then you put your film into the camera and then you shoot your infrared photos. And these photos look super interesting, so you should go to the website or search engine of your choice and just search for infrared photography. It's super interesting. Do that. Okay, now most of the people would stop here, but there is one more kind of film that I want you to know, because it's still out there. And this type of film are the so-called chromogenic black and white films. What's that again? Chromogenic black and white films are films that were created so that big labs are able to develop these films alongside with color films. Means they are developed in C41 color process. You do not develop them in the classical black and white process, but you develop these black and white films in the so-called C41 color process. Means if you want to shoot one of these films and you try to develop them in a regular black and white process, I don't would say that the results are too nice. They are meant to be developed in color chemistry. One of these films, for example, is Ilford XP2. So if you want to shoot black and white film, but you don't have a laboratory around that's developing classical black and white film, and you don't want to develop black and white film by yourself, go out, buy some, for example, Ilford XP2, and you can send this off to any color film development lab. That's not a word, I know. Okay, that's so far what you have to know about the sensitivity types of film. Now let's jump to the next chapter and let's real quickly talk about what ISO is. Hi, welcome back to the next chapter. Now in this chapter we're talking about what ISO or ASA is. When you buy a film, you're most likely to find something written on it like just a number like 400 in case of Ilford Delta 400, or something like Kodak Gold 200, or these things. What do these numbers mean? These numbers most of the time, I say most of the time, refer to the film's ISO, or also called ASA. ASA is the same as ISO, it's just an older, description for the same thing. ISO refers to the sensitivity of film, but not the sensitivity like to the color spectrum, as we were talking before, but how light sensitive it actually is. Like, how much light do you need to bring a picture onto this film? Good. I hope this was somehow understandable. The lower this number is, it starts out with films that have 12 ISO and goes all the way up to films with 3200 ISO. And the lower this number is, the less sensitive to light is the film. Means you need more light to bring a picture onto the film. Means you have either to open up your aperture or you have to use a longer exposure time. So what are the advantages of having a super slow speed film or a slower speed film? The advantage of having a slower speed film is that they have super fine grain. Some films even have nearly invisible grain. Means they are absolutely sharp and clear and very great for scanning, for example. Also, slower speed films are great for studio use, where you have control over your light environment. Now let's talk about the higher ISOs. Higher ISO always refers to a higher number. I'd say high ISO is from 400 and up. Now, higher ISO speed films need less light to produce a great image, but at the same time obviously have more grain. Or not more grain, but the grain size is a little bigger and therefore more recognizable. So what are the pros of using a film with a higher ISO? Well, the pros are obvious. You don't need too much light. Means if the weather conditions outdoors are not perfect or you're shooting in the evening, you want to choose a high ISO film. That's a pro of the film, because you don't need too much light, you can shoot it under different or more complicated light conditions. The cons are, as I already mentioned, it has larger grain size and therefore the grain is more recognizable. Depending on your personal taste, this can be either good or bad. I personally do not have any problem with grain, but I also don't have any problem if a film has less grain. It's just, it has to fit the image. So if you're just starting out and you're asking me what ISO speed of film I would recommend to you, then in my opinion I would go with a 400 speed film. Film with an ISO speed of 400 is a perfect mix of fine grain and light sensitivity. You can use this film in broad daylight, but also when it's cloudy or when it's getting towards the evening. So this is a very flexible film and I most of the time shoot ISO 400 film. Now that we are already talking about ISO, I want to make another chapter which is somehow referring to ISO, but yeah, you will see. Well, this chapter originally was not planned, but I wanted to create this chapter because there's a myth out there and I want to clean this myth up because it's sometimes what I hear is simply not true, okay? We're talking about something that is called pushing and pulling. And you quite often will hear people say, it's easy, you can make your ISO 400 film, for example, an ISO 1600 film. You can change the ISO, it's no problem. And if I hear such things, then, you know, I'm getting like goosebumps. It's bollocks. You can't change the ISO of your film. That's super important. Get that into your mind and remember it. You are not able to change the ISO of your film. What you can do, and that's what these people refer to, is something called pushing or pulling. If you push a film, you treat the film as if it was a higher ISO film. For example, you can shoot this film, you can set your camera meter or your spot meter or whatever you're using to an ISO of 1600, and then you treat this film or shoot this film as if it was an ISO 1600 film. Means you are underexposing your film. And then when you come back home in development, you overdevelop your film. This gives you the possibility to use these kind of films in weaker light situations and make some of the midtones more visible as if you would have used it as a 400 speed film. But you are not really changing the ISO of the film. What you are actually doing is you are changing the contrast curve of the film due to overdevelopment. Means you are crushing your shadows and you're rising your highlights very far up. Sometimes you also lose your highlights in order to save some of the midtones. So yes, you can treat film as if it was a higher ISO film, but it does not become a higher ISO film. This method has pros and cons. The pro is, as I just mentioned, you can use the film on lower light situations and it's becoming very contrasty. And if you like very contrasty images, then you can experiment with these methods. It's great. The cons are, as I already mentioned, you're losing your shadows and sometimes you're losing your highlight details. And another con is that you cannot choose for single pictures to shoot them, to push them or to pull them. If you decide to shoot this film as a 1600 film, then you have to shoot all 36 images as if they were a 1600 ISO film. So it's not possible to change the ISO within the different images or between the different images. You have to shoot the whole roll of film the same way. Okay, that's a con. Now, on the other hand, on the opposite side is pulling, where you do exactly the opposite thing. You treat the film as if it was a slower ISO speed film, so you overexpose it and you underdevelop it, and therefore you often produce images that have, well, less visible grain and also some very interesting results. Great. Whew. Let's jump to the next part. I wanted to say something about two different types of emulsion, and then we're jumping over to the camera stuff. Okay, welcome back. Now let me tell you two different things about emulsions. And this is a very quick one because you should know that there are two different types of emulsions. The so-called classical emulsions, which have a very rough grain structure, and then there are so-called newer emulsions, often referred to as flat grain structure, T-grain structure, and so on and so forth. And well, these are basically the newer emulsions. What's the difference? Older emulsions most of the time have more visible grain, whilst the newer emulsions have less visible grain, and therefore they are super great for scanning and so on. Does not mean you cannot scan old emulsions, like for example Ilford HP5 is a classical emulsion and it's great for scanning. But well, these newer emulsions, the T-grain structure and so on, they are towarded more towards people who are scanning their films. They aren't as old. I just wanted you to know that because you maybe will hear this one time, something like T-grain structure or flat crystalline structure or something like this, and then I want you to know that this is a newer type of emulsion versus the classical type of emulsions that have a more rough grain structure. And there are quite a lot of films out there using classical emulsions, like the Fomapan films, most of the Ilford films, Kodak Tri-X, and so on and so forth. These are all classical emulsions. Then you have films like, for example, the Delta 400 film, Kodak T-Max, and so on and so forth, and these are new emulsions, okay? Like, well, the Kodak T-Max is a T-grain emulsion, for example. Okay, That's it so far for film theory. Now we're jumping into how to buy a camera, what to keep in mind when you are buying your first camera, and well, see you then. Okay, let's put all these film things aside for a moment and let's talk about the instrument you need to take photos, the camera. As I told you in the beginning, in this video I'm referring to using an SLR camera, but no matter if you're using an SLR or if you're planning on buying a point-and-shoot camera, you should keep the same things in mind. Okay, now what should you keep in mind when buying your first SLR? First, let me say this. There are some people out there want to make you believe that you need a super expensive SLR, such as a super expensive Pentax, a super expensive Nikon, or so on and so forth. And that's not true. What you need is an SLR that gives you the possibility to manually set your shutter speed and your aperture. And well, it should have shutter speeds at least to 1/500th of a second, so you can work very flexible with the camera. And that's the most important thing you need, okay? Don't make the same mistake as many people do make with digital cameras. Don't try to buy the camera with the most crazy functions and so on and so forth, because you do not need all of this stuff, okay? All you need is manual control over your shutter speed and your aperture, okay? It's not about the most expensive camera, it's about a working camera, a camera that works properly, okay? Great. Now this brings me to my next point. When you buy a camera, the first thing you always do before you buy the camera or after you've got the camera is check the camera if it is, well, all fine with the camera, okay? Therefore, the first thing you do is checking your lens. You remove the lens from the camera. Most of the time you push this little button next to the lens and then you screw the lens, well, away from the camera, okay? Now, check if the lens focusing ring is working correctly. Check if the aperture ring is working correctly. And super important, take the lens, look into the light and make sure there is no fungus inside of the lens and that there is no dust in between the lens elements, or not a lot of dust. You sometimes cannot avoid dust, but it shouldn't be too much, okay? Now, fungus, you definitely do not want to have in your lens. Fungus is something very, very bad. This, well, you should go out there into a search machine and Google for fungus and lens, and you will see that you do not want to have this in your lens. It looks like, well, little skeletons torn over your glass, and basically these things are destroying the coating of the glass and they are eye removable. So you can't remove this anymore. The lens usually is broken if you have fungus, okay? So make sure your lens is A, working, and B, has no fungus or dust inside of it. And also a problem that lenses, especially older lenses, quite often have, they are fogging, okay? The glass is not translucent anymore. So also make sure your lens is not fogging. That's super important. Otherwise you have a crappy lens and you do not want to buy a crappy lens. Cool. Next thing you're doing is, well, taking the camera into your hand and examine the camera if there are any, well, obvious damages to the camera. And if not, then you have to do the following thing, and these are super important. A, open up the back of your camera. Most of the time you open up the back of your camera by using a handle at the side of the camera, or with older cameras there is this spool for rewinding your film. You have a handle next to your spool, taking out this part here, and then you push it and it opens up the back. No, you don't push it, you pull it, sorry. And what you do then is you take a look into your back, and first off, you take a look at all of your light seals, okay? Most cameras have light seals, and make sure these light seals are on the top conditions, otherwise you're risking to get light leaks onto your film, and you definitely do not want to have light leaks on your film. Okay, that's super important. Make sure all the light sealings are still working. Now, turn the camera around and watch here. Above the mirror, there also are some light seals. Make sure all the light seals in the front of the camera in here are okay. Take a look in there, that's important. The next thing you do is make sure you don't have any dirt, dust, oil or something like this here inside of the camera, because this could damage your film. Next is make sure that this mechanism here, the film transport mechanism, works like a charm. Operate the loading handle, which will also transport the film. And look if these things are turning correctly. And then simply, well, hit the trigger. Not the trigger, well, the exposure button here. And it should work like a charm. Do it again, see if everything works. Great. If everything until then is fine, that's great. So you're on a good way of having a good camera. But there's one thing that old cameras often lack and have problems with, and that's the exposure time. Now, it's a super important thing to check the exposure times. And obviously, you cannot check the exposure time with your eyes. But what you can do with your eyes is estimating or trying to see if the exposure times change at all or if they don't change. Therefore, you go to the lowest exposure time you have. Well, with my camera it's 8 seconds, so I'm going to 1 second to make this more easy. You load the film and you hit the button. So this was roughly a second. Let's do it again, let's see if it still works. Great. So this should work out fine. And for the very low speeds, such as a second or half a second, well, you can estimate this, okay? Like, let's change this to half a second. Sounds about correct. And now you change to a medium shutter speed, like 1/125th of a second. This should be definitely more fast. And now you go to your highest shutter speed and you should hear or see a definite difference there. Saw it? I hope so, but maybe you didn't see, you can't see it because of the speed of the video camera. Now, testing it like this, of course, is just a very rough test, and it's not a 100% precise, but it gives you a good chance of seeing if the shutter speeds still work or not. And if this works, then there's a good chance that they also work correctly. I don't say they work correctly all the time, but there's a good chance that they work correctly. Great. In the beginning, I was already mentioning that you do not need to buy the most expensive camera. And especially if you're on a budget, then you maybe want to know what kind of camera can you buy, but at the same time buy a good camera and a wide variety of lenses. Now, let me show you. Okay, there are older cameras. So this is a Nikon, a relatively new Nikon made in the 70s or 80s. It's a Nikon FE. I'm not quite sure about that anymore. So, but it's a newer camera with modern lenses, and they already have automatic apertures and so on and so forth. But there are cameras that are way cheaper, a little older, but they work like a charm as well. I'm referring to cameras with a so-called M42 lens mount. These cameras are super cheap. For example, there is the Porsche CTL, which is a relabeled Cosina camera, I think. And this camera, for example, costs around about $10, including a lens. And it's a great camera with a good internal electronic light meter and so on and so forth. But I'm coming to speak about these things in a minute. Now, if you want to start out super cheap, you can use an old M42 mount camera like this, for example. Not directly recommending this camera, it's a Zenit E. It's an old Soviet camera. It's a great camera and I'm using it, but if you're just starting out photography and you don't want to use external light meters and so on, I'm talking about this in a minute, then this camera isn't the right one because it has something called a selenium cell here, and they are everything but correct. Now, for this lens mount or this type of camera, you find a broad variety of lenses out there, and mostly they are super cheap. I mean, yes, there are some special lenses or some very famous lenses, for example, like this one. This is the Helios 44-2 lens. It's a M42 lens, 58 millimeter. and this lens gives you the so-called severely bokeh, so it's a very, very famous lens. So this of course is not the cheapest lens to buy, but for example this lens here, it's a 200mm lens with an aperture of 3.5. I paid around $3 to $5 for this lens, $3 to $5. So it's a super cheap lens, but it's also a super good lens, and if you stop it down by one stop to f4, then it's a super sharp lens. I mean, it's wow. Okay, and it's a super cheap lens, so you can have a great camera with a good variety of lenses if you go with the M42 system. So keep that in mind when buying a camera and you're on a budget. You can buy a cheap camera body and have good M42 lenses. And as usual, and as with digital cameras, the lens is more important than a super fancy camera body with 1000 functions you never use. Okay, that's important. Most of the time you only use your shutter speed and your aperture. And all the other quirks that the camera have, most of the time you're not going to use it, so you don't need it. Be creative. Use your mind to create pictures, not the technique. Okay. Now, I was starting to talk about things like light meters. Woo! But it's important to talk about them. As I already told you, there are a few different types of light meters. You have internal light meters inside of the camera. Most of the time these are spot meters or measure the overall light in the frame. And you have external light meters. External light meters, well, are often used by professional photographers. No, they are also used by lots of hobbyists, especially when you have an old camera like this one, then you definitely need an external light meter. You can either buy a professional external light meter or use a good smartphone app. And believe me, there are some smartphone apps, and I've tested them, especially one of them that is super close to a good light meter, and I metered with the app and then I metered with my light meter, and the results were just half a stop or a stop of difference, and half a stop or one stop of difference for film is nearly nothing. Now, what to keep in mind when buying a camera is you should make sure that when you do not want to have an external light meter and you don't want to spend extra money on this, that it has a good working internal light meter. And this means it should have an electronic light meter. It means, yes, the camera needs a battery for the light meter, but these kind of light meters are the ones that are more precise, okay? If you have an old camera like this one here, for example, these cameras use this old selenium cell, and this is absolutely not precise. This cell is just reacting to the light that's hitting the cell, and depending on the age of the cell, it's not even reacting to the light that's hitting the cell correctly. So really, that's not the way you want to go. Use either an external light meter or buy a camera with a good electronic internal light meter. Okay, great. I think that's it so far when it comes to buying a camera or to choosing a camera. Well, of course, you also have to consider things like the weight of the camera, how old the camera is. You could even smell on the camera if it stinks like cigarette smoke or something like this, and then you maybe don't want to buy it because you never know what's in there and so on and so forth. But these are some obvious things, and I don't want to tell you lots of obvious things here. In the next chapter, I do what I've promised. I show you how to put your film into your camera. Okay, we are finally going to load film into the camera. Yeah, so let's jump right into the next chapter and load some film into the camera. Okay, now let's put film into the camera. This works the same way with most cameras out there, with SLRs as well as with point-and-shoot cameras. The only difference that can occur, or one of the only differences that can occur, is how the camera, after loading the film, handles the film, but I'm gonna talk about this in a few seconds. Now for the beginning, let's just put the film into the camera. As I already mentioned, there are different methods of opening up a camera. Sometimes you have a handle on the side, and sometimes you need to pull. To pull on this handle here. Now, let's open this up. I'm sorry if it's not going perfectly well, because I'm doing this from the side, because my camera is standing here. Now, let's pull this handle up, and let's open the back of the camera. Now make sure this is still outside, so you can bring in the film in here. Now, in this case, you are bringing the film in heads down. Sometimes it's heads up, most of the time it's heads down. It always depends on the camera. Now let's bring this in. Pull this thing here and lay in the film. Great. Now you can bring this back down if you want. Great. Now push out the film a little until you reach the transport mechanism. And inside of the transport mechanism there is this slit, and you have usually 2 or 3 of them around this mechanism. And try to bring in the film, the thin part of the film, into this thing here. And make sure that this little teeth or tooth here is snapping into one of the sprocket holes of the film. Okay, and then try to load the film very slightly. And that's it. Now close the camera back again and make sure it's absolutely light tight and closed. And now you load the camera and shoot until this indicator goes to frame number 0. So, and the next time you're loading this and you're shooting will be your frame number 1 and will be an actual picture. So it's that easy to load a camera. I don't know why people can make a 20-minute video about putting film into a camera, because there's nothing super complicated about it. Okay, there I told you that some different cameras handle the film inside of the camera different. Before I tell you the difference, I wanna encourage you to one very important thing. When you finish shooting your film, whatever you do, or even when you did not finish shooting your film, whatever you do not open up the back of your camera. If you're new to shooting film, then let me tell you, this will destroy your film, because a complete film will be hit by light and all your pictures will be gone. Okay, do not open the back of the camera unless you wind it back your film into its canister. Therefore, you usually take this thing here and start turning it back. Okay, I'm obviously not gonna do this right now because it's a fresh film and I'm not winding back a fresh film, but this is super easy. There's no magic about it. Simply wind back the film into its canister. And this is where some modern cameras treat film differently. I, for example, have a camera. It's a Nikon F55, and there's a video, I'll link it somewhere here in the screen, where I show this camera, and this camera treats film a little different. So you bring in the film into the camera, and there is no handle that you could, well, load the camera or transport the film, because it's a battery-driven camera and it's loading film automatically. So you just bring in the film in the modern camera, lay it onto this transport mechanism, and then you close the lid of the camera again. And what's happening then is this camera is spooling the whole film from its container to the other side, to this film spool in here. So it's completely winding up the film on this side, and then every time you take a picture, it's bringing the film one frame after another back into its container, into its film container. That's why at the end of the shooting, or after your last frame, you just hear a small bzzz, and the film is back inside of its canister. So that's the difference between older and newer cameras. With older cameras, each frame you take brings the film from the canister to the other side of the camera, and you have to wind it back manually. And one thing I was nearly about to forget is to explain you what this little frame here is meant for. So you will see this kind of frame quite often with cameras, and some people don't understand what this is, and the solution again is super simple and not worth making a complete video about it. In here you can put these parts from your film, so you have to put something of it away, and so it's simply a reminder for you that you know what kind of film you have in your camera. Okay, as already mentioned, in the next video we're gonna take some pictures together, doing some fancy photo stuff. jumping around outdoors, you know. And then we're going back home and I'm explaining you how to develop your black and white film at home by yourself. Hope you liked it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.